Hello, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. Perhaps the biggest threat to Brazil's COVID-19 response is its president, Jair Bolsonaro. That's according to an editorial published last week in the British medical journal The Lancet, which notes with dismay the astonishingly high rate of transmission of the coronavirus in Brazil, aided and abetted by the negligence of many senior government officials from the president on down. Bolsonaro famously referred to COVID-19 as a, quote, measly cold, and continues to not only openly flout but actively discourage the life-saving restrictions on movement and physical distancing that have by now become commonplace around the world. But Bolsonaro's callous disregard for the suffering of his own citizens is not the only scandal in Brasilia. On April 24th, one of the star members of Bolsonaro's right-wing government, Justice Minister Sergio Moro, resigned in protest over the firing of the director of the National Police. The Lancet's editorial also took note of this episode, calling it, quote, a deadly distraction in the middle of a public health emergency and a stark sign that Brazil's leadership has lost its moral compass, if it ever had one. Joining me now from London to dig into all of this is Christopher Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. He's also the founder and former editor of America's Quarterly and former director of Global Americans, and he happens to also be a contributor to WPR. Chris, welcome back to Trendlines.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. Happy to be here.
So Jair Bolsonaro has had a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad month. And I think it's fair to say it started on April 16th when he fired his popular and very competent health minister, Luis Henrique Mandetta. Tell us a bit about him, what led to him incurring Bolsonaro's wrath, and why losing his voice was so damaging to the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, Luis Henrique was a health minister, was a doctor, a scientist, had become, if you will, sort of the voice of reason in the debate over what to do over coronavirus. And he had really represented, if you will, science and the independence of this analysis, similar to what we've seen in other countries. Very similar to Anthony Fauci in the United States and Trump. But Bolsonaro has even less sort of, tolerance for checks and balances and questions about his leadership and authority than President Donald Trump in the United States does. And in part also this was by his own, Luis Enrique's own popularity. According to a poll just after he was fired, 76% of Brazilians said they did not support his removal, and he was actually the most popular minister in the government, and was far more popular than Jair Bolsonaro, whose popularity has really hit bottom around 20%, according to some surveys. Luis Enrique was questioning the strategy of the government, continued to remind the Brazilian people about the rise in cases. And at about the time of his dismissal by Bolsonaro, you already had roughly about 25,000 cases in Brazil. And the first ones actually being identified in February 26th. So you had almost 2 months in which COVID was wreaking its havoc, if you will, on the Brazilian population. Jair Bolsonaro, as you had said earlier in the lead-in, had called it a measly cold and dismissed it, had challenged governors who were issuing stay-at-home orders, had even plunged into crowds, Jair Bolsonaro, and hugged people and shaken hands and so on. And you've got this pesky scientist armed with facts who for 2 months was reminding people of the mounting toll. And that just really annoyed Bolsonaro, and he fired him.
And who is his replacement? Is he more willing to toe the line?
Well, his replacement is a doctor. He's an oncologist, Nelson Teich. But it does look like, while he's said publicly, shortly after being appointed, that he would stand up to the president and always serve in the name of science. Obviously, everyone knows he has a very short leash. when it comes to questioning what Bolsonaro does and raising these issues. So, yes, in theory, he does. He's publicly committed to raising these issues, and he's a trained scientist, which helps, it turns out. But also, of course, this is an infamously thin-skinned autocratic president. And if you want to keep your job, you probably don't want to cross him.
You mentioned earlier some of the disagreements that Bolsonaro has gotten into with regional governors, local officials. What has that dynamic been like? How much leeway have local officials had to push back and implement some of their own stricter health restrictions?
Luckily, Brazil is a federal system, so there's a fair amount of scope for doing that. And in the larger urban areas or larger industrialized states like Sao Paulo as well, or Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais, governors have separated themselves from federal policy and implemented a series of stay-at-home measures and shuttered businesses, and been closely tracking and monitoring the reports and cases. Also, again, because it is a federal system, healthcare is very decentralized, as is education, for example, in Brazil. And state governments have a fair amount of budget autonomy to be able to implement measures. So what you're seeing is a really an institutional rift between a president who is certainly outlandish in his behavior, but is really an outsider candidate, and a series of governors who represent, in many cases, Brazil's traditional party system, which obviously failed in the most recent elections, in the 2018 elections, but that have really been much more autonomous and responsible, if you will, in trying to respond to people's demands and fears. And we're seeing that Brazil has, not on a per capita basis, is the worst in all of Latin America, with, as of May 10th, having over 11,000 deaths. So the concern is real, and governors are trying to respond to it. And again, it reflects this division in parties and divisions between national and subnational units.
Earlier, before we started recording, we were talking, and you mentioned the city of Manaus, the capital of Amazonas state in Brazil, which has the state has the highest number of indigenous people in Brazil. And this is an issue that we've covered, the climate of fear that Brazil's indigenous population has had to live under in the Bolsonaro presidency. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the ways in which COVID-19 is affecting indigenous people in Brazil and the unique challenges they face under Bolsonaro trying to address this pandemic.
Yeah, first of all, let me give a shout out to WPR and to you, Elliot. You guys have done a very good job on covering indigenous issues, not just in Brazil, but in South America. And that's not a gratuitous compliment. I think it speaks to the understanding that international relations issues and world policy issues do not just involve states interacting among themselves. So thank you for this. Manaus, in the capital city, has had one of the highest per capita outbreaks in all of Brazil. And of course, Brazil, as with South America and Latin America and the United States and Canada, the largest numbers of its indigenous and Native American populations were wiped out by disease when the Spanish and English and French conquerors and colonizers came, because they lacked the basic community, and that's true even now today. So you have one of the most ethnically diverse states in the Western Hemisphere, now with one of the highest rates of infection in Brazil, certainly. And the real fear here is that, coupled with this, is Bolsonaro has already given greater license to loggers and illegal miners, wildcat miners, and farmers to be able to clear land and invade what were virgin Amazonian rainforests, to clear them for either grazing area for cattle or to open them up for logging or for mining. And these individuals, mostly of European descent, will bring with them COVID viruses that will really wreak havoc on these isolated populations. And again, in a cycle that could be repeated 2 centuries later, could deeply affect their survival through the contact with a Western world, in this case, criminal elements. And let me add to this too, not only as Bolsonaro sort of given rhetorical license to these people by saying that he's not going to hold back the country's economic growth by maintaining these preserves, natural preserves and indigenous preserves. He's actually gutted the ministries or offices, secretaries that are in charge of protecting these forests and protecting these land reservations. So it's really a very unfortunate combination of, I would argue, racist policy, bad science policy at a federal government, and now, of course, virus, pandemic.
You mentioned earlier the deforestation that's been going on in Brazil, and this is something you've written about for us in the past. This is something that Bolsonaro has really put an emphasis on in terms of his approach to promoting agribusiness in Brazil, and I believe a lot of members of his government come from that sector.
Yeah, that's right, and a lot of his support comes from that sector. The saying is in Brazil that Bolsonaro's support comes from the 3 Bs: Bible, beef, and bullets, which is to say a lot of evangelicals support him. And he himself is an evangelical. And a lot of evangelical leaders have been arguing that they should continue to hold masses and that they should ignore any efforts at lockdown or self-distancing. And one even claims that going to church can prevent people from catching coronavirus. This is a large part of Bolsonaro's base. The second, of course, is beef. Is a lot of these clearings that you mentioned, Elliot, that I've written about, are actually in the name of cattle grazing. And there's huge demand in China, Asia, and even in the United States, although the U.S. has been far more cautious about this recently in accepting Brazilian beef imports. But that is really what's driving a lot of the deforestation in the Amazon. The last that I mentioned, though, by the way, is bullets, and that has to do with very much the sort of armed semi-paramilitaries, farmers groups, and the like that have invaded land that overtake indigenous reservations and the like, and they too are very big Bolsonaro supporters. So not only is he responding to large agribusiness concerns, he's responding to his real grassroots base in the north of Brazil.
We should mention that Bolsonaro himself is also a former captain in the military and has spoken fondly of Brazil's military dictatorship. He didn't do too well in the military, I understand, having retired as a captain, which doesn't really happen very much.
Yeah, it was a forced retirement. He ended up leading this mid-level officer mutiny, basically, and talking about low levels of military pay that obviously offended his superiors and led to his early retirement. I think involuntary retirement. But, there's nothing like a spurned lover in terms of wanting to try to recover yourself in the good graces. In this case, he's overcompensated now by really praising the military, bringing in a lot of military officials into his government, even calling recently, pining for the return of a military type government when things could run more efficiently. Luckily, most Brazilians don't support that, but he clearly is trying to keep himself in the good graces of his former superiors.
I want to move on to talk about other issues, but before we do, maybe you could address the economic aspect of the government's response, because this is something that disproportionately affects marginalized and vulnerable communities in Brazil, indigenous communities, as well as Afro-Brazilians, people who live in the favelas, people who have been historically neglected by the powers that be, tend to be a lot more vulnerable to the health impacts, given the proximity that they often live in, and the economic fallout of the virus. So what is the government doing to protect them and also to boost the economy as a whole during this crisis?
So on this point, this is really what Bolsonaro, besides his own ego and sense of sort of almost Messiah-like calling to lead the people, this is really what's driving his policies, if that can be called that. A large part of Brazil's population, around half of the active labor force, is actively engaged in the informal sector. That means that they're wage earners living almost day by day. And compounding that is in the basically the 2000s up until fairly recently, Brazil had seen a massive growth of the middle class, people coming out of poverty, and some numbers as high as 40 million people left poverty during the early 2000s. But most of those people were, even though they were out of poverty nominally, still lacked formal jobs or still lacked access to basic social safety nets or provisions of health insurance, private health insurance, and the like. And that's the people that Bolsonaro is claiming that he's acting on behalf of, those people in the informal sector, many of which actually in the economic contraction that followed in after 2017 slipped back into poverty. And these people are at risk both personally in health terms because they often live in very cramped quarters in the shanty towns of infamous favelas of Brazil, but also they're at risk economically. They have very few social safety net protections. Many live day to day. And the truth is all so far that's been done in Brazil to increase their protection has been to lower interest rates and try to goose the economy to continue to grow. And that's not going to be sufficient. There have been increased outlays in healthcare. But again, a lot of these people were not formally in the economy. So their access to things like unemployment insurance and those issues were simply not available to them. And it speaks to not just Brazil, but I think throughout Latin America, much of the developing world, and maybe even in the United States, the inherent insecurity of a large portion of the labor force that's often been overlooked. During boom times, people talked about in Latin America the rise of this middle class, but it was a very fragile middle class and one that, as I mentioned, didn't have access to a lot of social protections. Now we're seeing precisely how fragile they are, both in terms of healthcare and in terms of their economic security, and of course their any status in terms of economic improvement.
Now, for Bolsonaro, things got really bad when he lost Sergio Moro, whom I mentioned in the intro. He's another high-profile member of Bolsonaro's cabinet, justice minister, former judge, corruption fighter. This time it wasn't a sacking, but rather Moro who resigned. And as I understand, he did so in a way that wasn't too flattering of his former boss.
Yeah, Moro, first of all, it was a surprise that Moro even joined Bolsonaro because Sergio Moro was at the time very popular when he joined the president as his justice minister. He was seen as an independent, professional crusader, rooting out corruption, exposing the famous Lava Jato scandal, which over $2 billion was exchanged hands illegally among infrastructure companies.
You're referring to Operation Car Wash, as it's also known, right?
Yeah, sorry, I lapsed into Portuguese there. How do you say in English? The Lava Jato. Yes, the car wash scandal. And so he was seen as being a hero that stood up to corrupt politicians. That image became tarnished. First when he joined the Bolsonaro government as a justice minister, Bolsonaro was seen as being a loose cannon even then, and Moro was seen as being professional. But he was seen at the time as being somewhat of a weather vane in what would happen with this government. And so he lent his credibility to the Bolsonaro government. But then, first of all, he himself came under a cloud of scrutiny and criticism when it was revealed by a local journalist, Glenn Greenwald, that he had actually been, his staff had been communicating on trying to figure out how to indict former President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, the former president known affectionately as just Lula, which effectively removed him from the presidential contest when people expected him to run and very well could have beaten Bolsonaro. He was at the time under house arrest. So Bolsonaro, rather Moro was seen as being somewhat of a political tool in that case, not as impartial as he was held up to be. But then most recently with the scandals, what happened was Bolsonaro wanted to fire the national head of chief of police and appoint someone who would be much more pliable, because there are two investigations into his two sons. One of his sons, Flavio, for ties to the local mafia in Rio de Janeiro and even to paramilitary groups and criminal networks. And then his other son, Carlos, was involved in running a fake news racket. And so what the President Jair Bolsonaro wanted was, and he even said this, was a national police chief who would share intelligence with him on the investigations, which you don't need to be a lawyer to realize that's not wise. And so Moro, in classic Moro fashion, because the other thing that people began to tire of with Sergio Moro was he's kind of a showboat, loved the public limelight. And so as you mentioned, a very unusual resignation, he held a press conference even before he officially resigned, announced it. That did do damage to Bolsonaro, not so much because it revealed anything people didn't already know, but as I say, that Moro was seen as being somewhat of a weather vane on the directions of this government. But having said that, Moro had already burned his bridges with the Brazilian left when it was revealed his communications over the Lula investigation. So he had some credibility, but he was hardly seen as the crusading figure of integrity that he had sort of held up before even accepting to become justice minister.
And now what's happened with Bolsonaro's efforts to try to replace the national police director? Because I understand there's been some pushback on that from the courts.
Yes, so the Supreme Court has come out against it. And he actually also then, again, Bolsonaro is a man who brooks very little criticism and checks on his power. Bolsonaro called for public demonstrations to roll back the authority and power of the Supreme Court and the Congress, both very important checks on his power. And by doing so, really was calling for an interruption of the constitutional order. So far, the institutions fortunately have held up, but it represents, again, this very irascible, thin-skinned autocratic tendency of this president, and in this case, for a Supreme Court that has really become a beacon of independence on questioning everything from his ability and power to keep secret his COVID-19 tests, to his policy decisions and personnel decisions with the national police, to even his authority to reopen the economy and impose his will on state governors and mayors.
You mentioned the investigations into Bolsonaro's sons. How do the Bolsonaro family and his supporters respond to those allegations?
Much like populist leaders in other countries, Bolsonaro, as unpopular as he may be in a large, among the majority of Brazilians, still has a very solid base, a base that's willing to believe him, a base that sees any effort to investigate him as a challenge to their electoral choices and as a manifestation of a corrupt political elite that won't tolerate an outsider, despite the fact, by the way, that Bolsonaro has actually been in Congress for decades. And so, yeah, he maintains this ace, and he works it very, very well. This is the age of Twitter. So his son Carlos came out on Twitter, and he has 1.7 million followers by denouncing the investigation about his fake news racket. These are very powerful sources of support, and they're not going to go away. It speaks to the levels of polarization in Brazilian politics. It speaks to the levels of polarization we're seeing in other countries as well, where outsider candidates certainly tap a wellspring of frustration, anger, and the like, and can play on direct communications through social media to keep those sources of support fed a steady diet of very partisan, even factually incorrect at times, information.
Now, what does this all mean? Maybe you could tie this all together in terms of Bolsonaro's response to the coronavirus pandemic, this latest scandal over Moro and his resignation and the surrounding fallout from that. How much political thin ice is Bolsonaro on right now?
There have been a number of demonstrations calling for his removal. People have taken to the streets and they've been banging pots and pans. Certainly, if you look at the majority numbers, he does not enjoy a majority of the popular support in the country. But the problem is the country has already gone through a very wrenching and painful process when the Congress impeached then President Dilma Rousseff in 2016. This is a difficult time to be able to do that. That impeachment came under a charge that she had played fast and loose with some budgetary and accounting regulations. Had nothing to do with the broader corruption scandal, but she became somewhat of a victim to that.
She was also former President Lula's handpicked successor, right?
Exactly. And in many ways lacked the sort of popular credibility and the charisma of a Lula. I don't know if in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis, in the midst of an unprecedented economic contraction, there's a lot of appetite for the sort of political upheaval that would be engendered by yet another impeachment process. Having said that, certainly majority of Brazilians are considering whether they want to go through this very difficult time that will extend likely into a year, if not longer, with this capricious, unpredictable, autocratic blowhard of a president. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, he really has just demonstrated when told at one point that the deaths over COVID-19 had reached, I believe at the time there were 6,000, his response was, what am I supposed to do with it about that? What should I care? That level of lack of empathy and sort of just lack of caring about what the effects of his own behavior have on the country's health were, I think, for many people, very telling. But will this mean that he's removed? I'm not sure. And certainly he's played very well to his base. That includes, again, as I mentioned, evangelical ministers who are still very supportive. A lot of business people, even though a lot of his more formal business supporters have begun to back away, but also to the informal sector workers that he claims that he's representing by avoiding imposing a federal mandated shutdown. Whether they support him or not is difficult to tell. But again, in a deeply polarized situation where still a significant portion of the population sees him as a legitimate leader, it would be a very difficult process to remove. And into that, you also have to add the matter of the military, which he's done as much as he can to curry favor with, despite the fact they had shown him little love in the past.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ellie. This was great.
Christopher Sabatini is Senior Research Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House in London. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.